Last week, the U.S. reported its first severe case of bird flu found in a patient in Louisiana. For more, we're joined by Dr. Lena Wynn. She is the former Baltimore Health Commissioner. Dr. Lena Wynn, it's great to have you with us. So, bird flu. Is this report out of Louisiana worrisome? And if so, why?
Well, it's one more sign that the drumbeat of bird flu coming closer to humans is becoming a major threat. So we've already seen this year that there have been a number of mammalian species close to humans that now have bird flu outbreaks. We have outbreaks in poultry in all 50 states. 16 states have outbreaks in cattle. In California, in the last 30 days, there have been more than 300 herds that tested positive. And now we have 66 cases of bird flu in humans. And this is almost certainly a significant undercount because we have not been doing nearly enough testing, so we really don't know the extent of bird flu that's out there in humans. But this particular case, it's someone who is severely ill, but not only that, researchers have isolated the virus in this individual who is sick in Louisiana, and they found that this particular strain of the virus appears to have acquired mutations that make it more likely to bind to airway receptors. Bird flu has been around for a long time.
About 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. But it hasn't been a major issue in humans because while it spreads among birds, it hasn't really spread among mammals. But now there is this mutation. And there's another concern now, major too, which is that we're in flu season. And it's possible that a single person could have bird flu and seasonal flu at the same time.
Something called reassortment.
That's right.
Where things change because of one illness becoming another illness through reassortment of a mutated virus.
That's right, and so the viruses could exchange genes. You could develop a new hybrid virus. And if you now have a virus that's more contagious and causes more severe disease, that's when it becomes a major threat to humankind.
What should be happening in the Biden administration right now that isn't going on?
Yeah, there are two main things that they should be doing in the days that they have left. The first is to get testing out there. I feel like we should have learned our lesson from COVID that just because we aren't testing, it doesn't mean that the virus isn't there. It just means that we aren't looking for it. We should be having rapid tests, home tests available to all farm workers, to their families, for the clinicians taking care of them so that we aren't waiting for public labs and CDC labs to tell us what's bird flu or not. And the second very important thing is, this is not like the beginning of COVID where we were dealing with a new virus, we didn't have a vaccine. There actually is a vaccine developed already against H5N1. The Biden administration has contracted with manufacturers to make almost 5 million doses of the vaccine. However, they have not asked the FDA to authorize the vaccine. There's research done on it. They could get this authorized now and also get the vaccine out and to farm workers and to vulnerable people. I think that's the right approach because we don't know what the Trump administration is going to be doing around bird flu. If they have people coming in with anti-vaccine stances, could they hold up vaccine authorization? If they don't want to know how much bird flu is out there, could they withhold testing? I mean, that's a possibility. And I think the Biden administration in the remaining days should get testing and vaccines widely available so that at least it empowers state and local health officials and clinicians to do the right thing for their patients.
Dr. Wynn, is bird flu in humans super dangerous?
Well, the World Health Organization estimates that in prior outbreaks of the bird flu, that the mortality rate is 52%. 52%. However, in this most recent outbreak, it seems that most cases have been mild, and maybe some people even have asymptomatic infection. But the question is, we don't know what happens when bird flu affects more vulnerable individuals. People infected so far in the US have been mainly farm workers who are working, presumably generally healthy, as opposed to what happens when you get to children, to pregnant women, to older individuals with chronic illnesses. We don't know how deadly, how dangerous bird flu is going to be for those individuals. And again, that's one more reason why we don't want it to spread and acquire more mutations.
30 seconds. Norovirus is what you call it. Stomach bug is what I would call it. Numbers are surging. It's the holidays. What should people do to protect themselves?
Wash your hands really well, especially if you're going to buffets. Wash your hands if you're touching commonly touched surfaces before you touch your mouth, before you touch your nose. Norovirus is the most common foodborne illness here in the US. It's very hard to avoid once it's in your family. And also don't prepare food if you're having vomiting, diarrhea, stomach cramps, because you don't want to spread it to other people.
Dr. Lena Wynn, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it. We will have more questions for Dr. Wynn when we come back, but first we're going to take a quick break. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation with Dr. Leana Wen. Doctor, you talked about vaccines and testing in the context of bird flu and preparations. Therefore, vaccines and testings were part of the COVID conversation and the Trump administration when it was in charge. What level of concern do you have about some of the people appointed by President-elect Trump to incoming public health positions regarding issues of vaccine, testing, public health efficacy?
I think that there are some people coming into this administration who are very competent. For example, Dr. Marty Makary, a Johns Hopkins surgeon. We have worked together for the last 10 plus years on issues like hospital medical error. He's an independent thinker who really listens to science and is willing to change his mind when there is new evidence that emerges. But I have a lot of concern, and I've spoken to my colleagues in medicine and public health, and I think all of us share this concern, in particular about Robert F. Kennedy, the nominee to be the head of Health and Human Services. Kennedy has espoused many views in the past that are anti-vaccine. In fact, he's been one of the leading anti-vaccine advocates in the country, if not in the world, over the last couple of decades. He's also someone who has made his career from being an activist and not a scientist. And what I mean is that if you're a scientist, even if you have deeply held convictions, you should be willing to change your mind if there are new facts that are presented. It's a fact that childhood vaccines are safe and they are life-saving. A CDC analysis just now found that the childhood vaccinations have saved over 1.1 million children's lives over the last 20 years. According to a Lancet study, childhood vaccines saved 154 million lives globally over the last 50 years. I mean, these are facts. And it's very concerning to have someone who doesn't believe in how science works, in basic scientific principles, to be in charge of our nation's preeminent scientific and medical agencies.
With that perspective, do you believe it's more imperative than you described earlier for the Biden administration to move forward on bird flu vaccinations and testing?
Well, that's exactly it. I don't want to wait for the Trump administration to potentially hold up the vaccines, saying that they want more evidence. Look, evidence is always good and facts are always good. New research is always good. But you also have to weigh that against a potential catastrophe, as we could be having for bird flu, the way that we had for COVID. There's no reason why we should hold off on getting more testing. We need to know how much bird flu there is out there. We need to know if there are new mutations that are being developed. Other countries also need to know so that they can prepare as well. And I think it's a major problem that in the US, we have been holding back on testing and also holding back on getting the vaccines deployed that are already developed.
Dr. Leana Wen, thank you so much for your expertise. Thanking you twice, and a Happy New Year to you.
Thank you to you too, Major.
We'll be right back. We turn now to the economy and what to expect in year 2025. We do so with Bank of America senior economist Aditya Bhave. Aditya, good morning. It's great to see you. I've covered a lot of presidential transitions. There's always an assessment by the outgoing president about what kind of economy he's giving to his successor. That's a political conversation. Objectively, what is the economy the incoming Trump administration is inheriting?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So we think the economy has really solid momentum going into next year. You can look at our internal card data, for example, that shows a nice acceleration in spending going into the holidays. You can also look at the TSA data on airport traffic, and that looks really strong around the holiday period as well. You can also think about things via a wider lens. Start in 2022, that was a year in which GDP grew by only 1%. CPI inflation peaked at 9%, and all of the talk back then was stagflation. When, not if, is a recession going to arrive? Why are workers quitting? And then you look at what happened over the following 2 years, right? This was quite unexpected and in a very pleasant way. 3% GDP growth, inflation coming down, labor productivity moving up. So all positives that leave us optimistic going into next year that we can continue to grow above 2%, albeit with somewhat sticky inflation.
Is there any larger X factor in 2025 than the scale and scope of promised mass deportations of the Trump administration?
From a market perspective, I think the two biggest issues will actually be fiscal policy and trade policy. And there's a lot of uncertainty around those as well, just as there is around immigration policy. So with fiscal policy, you had this conversation in your last segment, right? The majority for Republicans in the House is very, very narrow. So if they want to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they want to do more fiscal stimulus, which we think will probably eventually get done, they have a very slim margin to work with. And then with trade policy, we really need to understand, how much of the tariffs that President-elect Trump has threatened are actually going to be implemented versus how much is a negotiating tool, right? So how much is transactional.
And for mass deportations, how much do you fear that could affect the labor market in our country? That is to say, put upward pressure on prices, because if there is mass deportations and workplace inspections, lots of workers in agriculture, construction, meat processing, and other vital industries could be pulled out of those sectors.
So I think our base case is that there will be a slowdown in the flow of immigrants, right? It's harder to know what will actually happen around deportations. From an economic perspective, a worker is also a consumer. So there are some downside risks to economic activity if there's a large change in the population, right? That's just math. In terms of pressures in specific sectors, it's really going to depend on how things play out. Yes, there could be labor shortages in certain sectors, but it's very hard to know at this stage.
Many CEOs I listen to say that they expect the tariffs and regulatory relief to kind of wash themselves out, meaning essentially you put them together, it's benign on the U.S. economy. Is that your perspective?
I think that's about right. If you look at the 4 key policy issues that we've been focused on, as I said earlier, trade, fiscal policy, immigration policy, and deregulation, we think they'll roughly wash out. But again, the starting point is pretty helpful, right? So we think that we can continue to grow at around 2 to 2.5% the coming year, as well as in 2026.
So in reading year-end summaries, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post, all in their own way, warned that the stock market may be overvalued, may be too exuberant. Do you share any of those concerns?
I'm not an equity analyst, so it's hard for me to say, to give a specific number. Our equity strategists do think that stocks can continue to run up to around 6,600, 6,700 by the end of this year. What you can say is that obviously there's been a pretty aggressive run-up in tech stocks, but it is not of the same scale that we saw in the late 90s if we're really worried about a similar bubble.
What effect do you believe cryptocurrencies and artificial intelligence will play in the global economy 2025?
So when it comes to AI, I think there's 2 things to be said. The actual impact of AI adoption is probably going to show up pretty slowly in the data, so I don't know that we'll necessarily see that in 2025 or 2026. It might be a story for a few years down the line. But what has been really impactful already, and probably will be much more impactful in the coming years, is just laying the groundwork for AI. Right? So if you see the increases in investment in data centers, and you think about what all that requires, right? Yes. It requires materials, it requires energy supply, it requires labor. You put, sure.
Yes, I'm sorry to cut you off. We have a hard break. We need to get you. Aditya Bhave from Bank of America. Happy New Year, and thank you so much for being with us. We'll be right back in just a moment. In 22 days, Donald Trump will be sworn in as the nation's 47th president, only the second to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. For more perspective on the most powerful position in the world, we spoke with David Rubenstein, the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group. His new book, The Highest Calling, studies the highs and lows of some of this country's most consequential presidents. How would you compare, based on your study of the presidency, are unsettled times now to unsettled times past?
Well, nothing is as bad as a civil war when we had 3% of our population killed, and the fighting in Washington was so bad that about 60 different times members of Congress hit other members of Congress on the floor of the Congress. So we're not quite there yet. Clearly, we're going into some uncharted waters because we have a president coming back who had been president before. That hadn't happened since Grover Cleveland was reelected in 1892. And Trump has got more power than I think many people would have thought by the virtue of his victory size. And I do think he's going to act like he's got a mandate, and Washington is bracing for what's going to happen.
Related to that, before the election results were known, polls indicated pretty consistently that Trump supporters were afraid if Harris would win. Harris supporters were afraid if Trump would win. Based on your study of this institution, the presidency, can you recall a time where that fear of an outcome was as prevalent as it was leading into this election?
Well, there have been a couple of times when people really were afraid that the next person coming in that was the opposite party would really hurt the country in many ways. Clearly, my former boss, Jimmy Carter, really feared Ronald Reagan. He thought that Ronald Reagan was going to undo many of the things that Carter had done. Obviously, Reagan won by a landslide. And you've seen other times when this has happened as well. So, for example, when FDR won the first time, Herbert Hoover could not believe that this man, Herbert Hoover, who had been such a distinguished American before he was president, and while he was president, he had problems, but he was a very distinguished person. He never took FDR seriously, and FDR didn't really take Hoover that seriously. He refused to really meet with him, essentially, or met with him briefly, and they just didn't want anything to do with each other.
You mentioned Grover Cleveland. There's not a chapter in the book about Grover Cleveland. Is there anything that retroactively fascinates you about the Cleveland presidency now that Trump has returned to office? Or are you similarly fascinated by the time in which he was president, the Gilded Age?
Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, former governor of New York, very well respected, but he lost the election in 1888, and he came back in 1892. Now, one of the things we don't really know is whether a president, when he has a second term after he's been out of office, whether he'll be fresher, whether he'll bring better people in, whether he'll be more experienced. For example, Grover Cleveland's second term was reasonably successful, and maybe Trump's will be as well.
One of the things the nation struggled with this last 18 months or so was the collision of politics and the law. Do you think there are any lessons to be learned from this clash and the politics that came from the clash of trying to indict and try someone who had been president of the United States and was aspiring to that office again?
I think there is a feeling among many people that it wasn't a good idea to indict the President of the United States. I think the trial in New York, where Trump was convicted, I think really helped him in his election effort. And I think there are many people who are Trump supporters who believe that the indictments that came out of the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, were really political as well. And so I think both sides feel that the other side is really talking past each other. The people who are in the Justice Department now feel that these indictments were fair and correct and has special prosecutor and so forth. The Trump people believe they were completely political. I hope going forward that the Justice Department is not seen as political, because one of the strengths of this country has been the rule of law. And I hope that the Justice Department that's coming in now will continue that tradition.
Do you have a president in mind who, based on your study, grew in your regard, and a president in your mind who, based on your study, got more diminished?
Harry Truman left office extremely unpopular, very unpopular, and he was thought to be an inappropriate successor to the great FDR. Now, because of books by David McCullough and other people who have written great books about Truman, people see him as one of our great presidents, because post-World War II, he helped end the war because he dropped the atomic bomb, which many people say was a mistake, but I would say many historians think it was necessary.
And he never doubted.
He never doubted. He never had self-doubt. Self-doubt was not one of his things. He always believed it was the right decision. But he also was responsible for NATO, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and the CIA, which he created as well. All these things he created.
The recognition of Israel.
Yes, he recognized Israel, even though his Secretary of State threatened to resign over it. So he was a person who's really risen up. A person who's gone down, I would say, there are two that have gone down a lot. One is Andrew Jackson. Remember, Democrats used to say, we're going to have a Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner. You don't have that anymore, because Jackson is now widely seen as being racist and very anti-Native American, and he really did many things that I think killed a lot of people, particularly in the Native American community. So he's not really well respected today by scholars. Another person I would say is that whose reputation is going down is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the great reformer. After being president of Princeton, 2 years later, he's governor of New Jersey, then president of the United States. However, he now is widely seen as having done two things that were really big mistakes. One, he resegregated the federal workforce and had been integrated. Two, and this is very damaging, I think, as well, he had a stroke. And with about 18 months to go, he couldn't really do what he had done before. He hid that from the public, and his wife essentially became a shadow president. She was really making decisions and deciding things that maybe he should have decided, and the public didn't know this. And that was a big problem.
You often ask biographers what question they would most want to pose to the subject of their presidential biography. Let me expand on that. If you could go to dinner with any president, who would it be, and what question would you want to make sure you got answered?
Without doubt, the greatest president and the greatest American ever is Abraham Lincoln. He was a person who was not an abolitionist, but ultimately came to free the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. And he also won the Civil War despite the fact that many people in the North didn't really want to fight the Civil War. They'd say, let the South go, we'll have our own country. Lincoln said, no, we're going to hold the Union together. And he did that. We lost 3% of our population in the war, but he kept the Union together and I think made the United States a stronger country as a result. We ended slavery eventually because of the 13th Amendment. But most importantly, he did it with humility. He didn't run around saying, look, I just won the Civil War. I just did the Gettysburg Address. Isn't that a great speech? He didn't do that. He didn't brag about it. He was very humble, and I think he had a sense of humor and a sense of perspective that is a really good thing for presidents. And I would like to ask him, do you have any regrets about not having freed the slaves earlier? Do you have any regrets about not getting rid of some of your generals earlier who were not very good? And he waited a couple years before he got Ulysses S. Grant in. Grant is also a person I should mention. He had the most amazing meteoric rise of almost anybody to become president. He was selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis in 1860. The war breaks out in 1861, more or less, and 8 years later, he's president of the United States. I mean, it's just amazing.
You mentioned humility. George W. Bush told you in your interview with him that that was the most important characteristic a president can possess. I've read other words that are important for presidents: courage, compassion, curiosity, decisiveness. Based on your study, what would you say is the most important?
I think the most important thing is having a perspective that you really want to do what's right for the American people. You're not trying to make money, you're not trying to feather your own nest, you're not trying to worry about history, you're just trying to do what's best for the American people. The qualities that I admire in leaders are people who are reasonably intelligent but not geniuses. You don't have to be a genius to be a great president. People who are willing to listen to other people, people that have some humility, people that are highly ethical. Those are the qualities that I think great leaders have in any area. Overall, we've gotten some pretty talented people who've served as President of the United States, and we've been fortunate. Lincoln, Washington, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson, and modern-day presidents, Eisenhower, among others, have had some really great attributes, and the country's good, and I think better off for having had good people serve. And one of my concerns in the future is that because it's become so political in Washington sometimes, and the infighting has been so intense, that I'm not sure that as many good people want to rise up and run for president in the future as we've seen in the past.
You mentioned in your very first answer the Civil War, the greatest time of testing in our country's history. You don't have to be very aggressive online to find casual talk among Americans about another Civil War. They bandy it about with some frequency. How worried are you about that, and do you think the mere discussion of it creates the potential of an inevitability?
Well, I think there has been discussion. Some people say the red states and the blue states should separate, but I don't think that's realistic or really going to happen. I think the country realizes that we are the strongest power in the world, economically, militarily, politically, culturally, in part because the country's got a big enough population, and in part because we have a lot of attributes in red and blue states. I don't think it's realistic. People talk about that, but I don't think that's going to happen. The country's not going to be split up the way it was in the Civil War. I just don't see that as being realistic or desirable.
Is there any doubt in your mind that presidents, all presidents, must guard against bitterness, anger, resentment, some of the things that fueled their pursuit of the office in the first place? Meaning once they got there, they need to set those things aside, even though they were part of the engine?
Everybody goes through life and has ups and downs, and you get a lot of bitterness and you get resentment of people. People that are good presidents openly rise up above that. A lot of people criticize Abraham Lincoln for many, many things. They called him all kinds of terrible names, and they did say he was barely human.
Called him a gorilla.
Yes, and he rose above that. And I think you have to rise above it, and hopefully when you don't have to worry about politics anymore, in a second term, for example, you can rise above all the concerns you've had. When you're president of the United States, if you carry your resentments too long, it can affect other people adversely. So I think in the case of President Trump, for example, clearly he has some resentments, but I think overall I believe he's going to rise above that in his second term.
Is Richard Nixon, which you in your book describe as a tragic figure, almost a Shakespearean-like tragic figure, the most available cautionary tale about resentments in the presidency?
If only Shakespeare had been alive to write about Richard Nixon, it would have been a wonderful tragedy. Here's a man who's really talented, very smart. He stumbles from running for president in 1960, barely loses for 1962 in the governorship of California, and comes back and is elected in 1968 against all the odds. But he resented the people that looked down on him. He resented the liberals. He resented the Ivy Leaguers, as he would call them. And he really, I think, took those resentments and he perpetuated them through his chief of staff, Rob Haldeman, and other people. And the result was a terrible thing called Watergate. I think Richard Nixon, had he not had Watergate, I think he would have gone down as a really impressive president because of the opening to China, things he did on the environment. But Watergate will be what he's remembered for.
Was he the least ethical president in our history?
I don't think that's easy to say, because some presidents had issues that we don't know about as much. Richard Nixon wasn't a person who was trying to make money for himself necessarily. He wasn't grafting himself into business deals and so forth, but I think he had some ethical failings.
Book's called The Highest Calling. Is the presidency the highest calling? Some might argue that an age-defining innovation is a higher calling, or being a captain of industry is a higher calling, or just being a simple CEO employing tens of thousands of people is a higher calling. Why is it the highest calling?
The reason I called it the highest calling, and I had historically said that private equity, my profession, was the highest calling, but that was more tongue-in-cheek, is this. When Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to help end World War I, he was cheered by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Parisians. And people for the first time realized the most important person in the United States, in the world really, is the President of the United States. And that's been true almost since Wilson came back from Paris. When FDR was running the world really effectively, because he was President of the United States during World War II, he was the most important person in the world for sure. And I think ever since then, because of the economic, military, political power of the United States, whoever is the leader of the United States is almost certainly the most powerful person in the world, and pursuing what I would call the highest calling, because you can affect the lives of people so much more significantly as President of the United States than any other job in the world.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You can watch the extended interview on our YouTube page or on our website, facethenation.com. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you very much for watching, and let me be among the first to wish you a Happy New Year. For Face the Nation, I'm Major Garrett.